On January 7, 1991, the United States Navy killed its most expensive aircraft before it ever left the ground. Not delayed, not downgraded. Terminated, a legal word for a program the government said had failed to earn its own existence. Nearly $3 billion had already been spent. Thousands of engineers, two of the largest defense contractors in the country, and 8 years of development had produced exactly one aircraft, a full-scale mock-up sitting in a hangar that would never fly. The airplane was called the A-12 Avenger II. The Navy needed it to replace an aging bomber that could no longer survive modern air defenses. What the contractors delivered instead was a jet that kept gaining weight it wasn't supposed to gain, a radar system that kept missing deadlines it wasn't supposed to miss, and a price tag that no one, not the engineers, not the executives, not the Secretary of Defense himself, could actually confirm. So Dick Cheney made a call that had never been made at that scale in Pentagon history. He didn't just cancel the A-12, he accused the contractors of default, of breaking their contract, and ordered them to pay the money back. McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics said no. What followed was not a story about an airplane anymore. It became the longest contract dispute in the history of American defense procurement, a legal war that would outlive the Cold War, outlive two Bushes, and not reach its final verdict until 2014. The aircraft the Navy needed to replace had been flying since 1963. The A-6 Intruder was slow, subsonic, and built for a different war. It could fly low, fly at night, and drop bombs through weather that grounded almost everything else in the fleet. A genuine workhorse, trusted by two generations of naval aviators. But by the early 1980s, the world it had been designed for no longer existed. Soviet air defenses had changed everything. Radar networks now stretched in overlapping layers, feeding data to surface-to-air missile batteries that could track and kill an aircraft from ranges the Intruder's designers had never planned for. The SA-10 system, entering Soviet service in the early 1980s, could engage targets at altitudes and distances that made low and slow penetration tactics, the entire operating philosophy of the A-6, look increasingly like a death sentence. Airborne early warning aircraft extended that reach even further, closing the gaps an Intruder crew might once have exploited. Naval planners watched the trend lines and did not like what they saw. A carrier air wing built around the A-6 was a wing built to fight the 1960s. The 1990s were going to demand something the Navy had never fielded before, an aircraft that enemy radar could barely see at all. That idea, low observability, what the public would later call stealth, was not new to American aviation. The Air Force had been quietly developing radar-evading aircraft since the late 1970s, testing shapes and radar-absorbing materials in classified programs kept far from public view. What was new was the demand to put that technology on a boat. A stealth aircraft designed for a runway is one kind of engineering problem. A stealth aircraft designed to survive a catapult launch, an arrested landing, months of saltwater exposure, and storage in the cramped, magnetic, vibration-heavy environment of a carrier hangar deck is an entirely different one. Every stealth coating, every radar-absorbing panel, every precisely shaped edge that made an aircraft invisible on enemy radar screens also had to survive being folded, catapulted, and slammed onto a moving flight deck hundreds of times over a service life measured in decades. No one had ever built that aircraft. No one was entirely sure it could be built. The Navy's answer was to try anyway. Planners began drafting requirements for a new class of aircraft, a stealthy, all-weather, carrier-based strike platform that could penetrate the same integrated air defenses that were making the A-6 obsolete, deliver a heavy payload, and still land safely on a pitching flight deck at sea. The requirement alone represented one of the most technically ambitious aircraft programs the Navy had ever attempted. There was pressure behind the ambition too. Congress and the Pentagon were already watching stealth technology reshape the Air Force's plans, and Navy leadership did not want naval aviation left behind in a technological era that was moving fast. A carrier air wing without a stealth strike aircraft risked becoming a liability rather than an asset in any future conflict against a modern, radar-dense adversary. By 1983, the requirement had a name and a mission: replace the A-6 Intruder, restore the Navy's ability to penetrate the world's most dangerous airspace, and do it from the deck of an aircraft carrier. What the Navy did not yet have was an aircraft. It did not have a design, it did not have a contractor, and it did not yet know that the very ambition driving the requirement, stealth, on a carrier, on a budget, on a schedule, would eventually become the reason the program collapsed. The search for that aircraft was about to begin, and two of the largest names in American aerospace were about to make a decision that would define the next 3 decades of their corporate history. The Advanced Tactical Aircraft program officially launched in 1983, and almost immediately, it became clear this would not be a contest between equals fighting alone. The technical demands were staggering. A contractor would need mastery of stealth shaping and radar-absorbent materials, deep experience with carrier-suitable airframes able to survive catapult and arrestment loads, and the manufacturing capacity to build a genuinely new class of combat aircraft on a fixed timeline. Few companies in the country could claim even 2 of those 3. Almost none could claim all 3 alone. Northrop, fresh off its work on what would become the B-2 stealth bomber, understood flying wing aerodynamics and radar-defeating shapes better than almost anyone on Earth. But Northrop's stealth expertise had been built entirely around Air Force requirements: long runways, no carrier landings, no saltwater corrosion, no folding wings. Lockheed carried its own stealth pedigree from the F-117 program, developed in the secrecy of its Skunk Works division. But Lockheed, too, was an Air Force house, with limited recent experience building aircraft meant to survive a flight deck. The company with the deepest carrier aviation experience in America was Grumman, the firm that had built the A-6 Intruder the Navy was now trying to replace, along with generations of other carrier aircraft going back to World War II. But Grumman's stealth credentials were thin. Building a genuinely low-observable aircraft required design philosophy. Grumman had never needed to develop. The industry's answer to this mismatch was teaming, pairing a company's strength in one discipline with a rival's strength in another, then submitting a joint bid as a single team competing for a single contract. It was already common practice on major defense programs by the 1980s, and the ATA competition would become one of its highest-stakes tests. 2 bids emerged as the frontrunners. The first paired Northrop with Grumman, stealth expertise joined to carrier aviation heritage, on paper a natural fit. The second paired McDonnell Douglas with General Dynamics. McDonnell Douglas brought decades of Navy carrier aircraft manufacturing experience, along with the FA-18 Hornet program, already in production and proven at sea. General Dynamics brought its own combat aircraft engineering pedigree from the F-16 program and access to composite materials research the Air Force had funded for its own stealth efforts. Individually, neither company had built a true low-observable aircraft. Together, the team argued they had every piece the Navy needed. It was, on paper, a partnership between 2 of the most established names in American military aviation, and that was precisely the point. In a competition this technically demanding, the Navy wanted contractors who had already proven they could deliver carrier aircraft on schedule, at scale, in the real world. Reputation was collateral. 2 decades of delivered airframes stood behind the McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics name in a way that raw stealth innovation alone could not match. The 2 teams spent years refining competing proposals, design studies, wind tunnel testing, radar cross-section modeling, cost estimates stretching years into the future for an aircraft that existed only on paper and in classified briefing rooms. In January 1988, the Navy made its decision. The contract for full-scale development of the Advanced Tactical Aircraft went to the McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics team. The prize was a fixed-price incentive contract with a target value of $4.38 billion and a ceiling of $4.84 billion, an enormous sum, structured in a way that placed almost all the financial risk of cost growth directly onto the 2 contractors, not onto the government that had just handed them one of the most technically unprecedented assignments in Navy aviation history. The aircraft itself already had a name, chosen to echo naval aviation's own past, Avenger II, after the Grumman TBF Avenger of the Second World War, a tribute the design would spend the next 3 years failing to live up to. Northrop and Grumman had lost. McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics had won. And somewhere in the fine print of a fixed-price contract signed for an aircraft that had never been built, using technology no one had ever proven could survive a carrier deck, the first fracture in the program had already been written into the paperwork, long before a single rivet was ever driven. The shape itself was the argument. Viewed from above, the A-12 Avenger II looked almost nothing like an airplane. It looked like a triangle, a flat symmetrical wedge with no vertical tail, no protruding engines, no fuselage bulge breaking its outline. Engineers on the program called it the flying wing. Everyone else, almost immediately, started calling it the flying Dorito. The shape was not an aesthetic choice. It was physics, translated into sheet metal. Radar works by sending out a beam of electromagnetic energy and measuring what bounces back. A conventional aircraft, with its rounded fuselage, angled tail fins, and exposed engine intakes, reflects that energy in dozens of directions at once, sending a strong, clear signal straight back to the receiver that sent it. A stealth aircraft is not invisible. It simply refuses to reflect the beam back the way it came. Every flat surface, every edge, every seam on the A-12 was angled to redirect incoming radar energy away from its source, scattering it into empty sky instead of bouncing it home. Radar cross-section, the measurement of how large an aircraft appears on an enemy's screen, regardless of its actual physical size, was the number that mattered most. On paper, the A-12's radar cross-section was reported to be smaller than that of a metal marble, a jet with a wingspan wider than 70 feet, designed to appear on enemy radar as a speck barely larger than a bird. The tailless design served the same purpose from a different angle. Vertical tail fins are radar reflectors almost by definition. Flat, upright surfaces standing perpendicular to an aircraft's direction of travel, catching radar energy from the side like a mirror catches sunlight. Remove the tail and remove one of the largest radar signatures on any conventional jet. The trade-off was steering. Without a vertical tail, the A-12 would need to control yaw, the side-to-side rotation of the aircraft, through split ailerons and other unconventional control surfaces, a genuinely difficult flight control problem that engineers on the program had to solve almost entirely from first principles. Every intake, every access panel, every seam where one piece of the airframe met another was a potential weakness in that invisibility. Radar-absorbent coatings. Special materials applied to the aircraft's skin, designed to soak up incoming radar energy rather than reflect it, had to be flawless and continuous across the entire airframe. A single gap, a single misaligned panel, a single rivet head, sitting a fraction of an inch too high, could turn a nearly invisible aircraft into a very expensive, very visible target. None of this was hypothetical to the engineers designing it. Every one of these problems had been solved before, in isolation, on other aircraft. What no one had ever done was solve all of them simultaneously, on an airframe that also had to survive catapult launches generating several times the force of gravity, arrested landings that slammed the aircraft to a stop in under 2 seconds, and years of exposure to saltwater corrosion that ate through unprotected metal in a fraction of the time it took on land. On paper, the numbers the contractors promised were extraordinary. The A-12 was projected to carry a payload of roughly 5,000 pounds internally, bombs and missiles tucked inside weapons bays rather than hung on external pylons, where they would have destroyed the aircraft's stealth profile the instant they were attached. Combat radius estimates stretched past 800 nautical miles, giving carrier strike groups the ability to hit targets deep inland without exposing the ship itself to retaliation. The flying wing shape, in theory, offered exceptional fuel efficiency and lift-to-drag performance, translating directly into that extended range. Defense officials briefing Congress described an aircraft that would give the Navy a strike capability no adversary could detect until it was far too late to respond. It was the kind of capability that justified an enormous price tag, on paper, before a single flight test had ever taken place. But every one of those numbers, the radar cross-section, the payload, the range, the weight the aircraft was supposed to weigh when finished, existed only in engineering models and wind tunnel data. They were promises made about an airframe that had not yet been built, by a design team that was about to discover just how much harder it was to build a shape like this than it was to draw one. The triangle looked perfect in the wind tunnel. It looked perfect on paper. What no one yet knew was how much heavier it was about to become. The moment it left the drawing board and became a real airplane, made of real materials that had to actually fly. Almost everything about the A-12 program happened behind a wall that even the Pentagon's own oversight structure could not fully see through. The program was designated a Special Access Program, a classification tier reserved for the government's most sensitive projects, sitting above ordinary top-secret clearance. Special access programs restrict information not just by rank or clearance level, but by name. Only individuals specifically read into the program, cleared by name for that exact project, were permitted to see detailed technical and financial reporting. Everyone else, including many officials whose job it was to oversee defense spending, was locked out by design. The justification was straightforward on its face. Stealth technology was the most sensitive capability in American military aviation. Radar cross-section data, the specific composite materials used in the airframe, the exact shaping techniques that made the aircraft difficult to detect, all of it represented years of classified research the Pentagon had no intention of leaking to Soviet intelligence services. Compartmentalizing that information, restricting it to a small circle of engineers, contractors, and program officials who absolutely needed it, was standard practice for any program built around a genuine technological edge. But secrecy built to protect a design also protected the people managing it, and that protection cut in a direction no one had fully accounted for. Ordinary defense programs are subject to layers of routine oversight. Budget analysts track spending against projections. Independent auditors review contractor progress reports. Congressional committees receive briefings detailed enough to catch a program drifting off course before the drift becomes a crisis. Special access classification did not eliminate these mechanisms outright, but it narrowed them dramatically, restricting even the internal Pentagon officials who might have caught early warning signs to a small cleared circle, a circle that, in the case of the A-12, largely consisted of the same military and contractor personnel whose careers depended on the program's continued success. The result was a structural blind spot. The people most capable of raising an alarm about the program's technical and financial health were, in many cases, the same people with the strongest incentive not to. This was not unique to the A-12. Special access programs had shielded stealth research since the earliest days of the F-117 and B-2 programs, and in those cases, the tight compartmentalization had largely worked as intended, protecting genuine technological secrets without derailing program execution. What made the A-12 different was the scale of what was being hidden inside that compartment and how long it stayed hidden. Program managers reporting up the chain to Navy leadership operated inside a system that rewarded confidence and punished alarm. A manager who reported the program was on schedule, on budget, and meeting its technical milestones kept his position and his security clearance intact. A manager who reported serious problems risked being seen as the one who couldn't deliver, on a program so classified that outside verification of his claims was nearly impossible. The incentive structure, layered on top of an already restrictive classification system, quietly rewarded optimism over honesty. Contractors felt the same pressure from the other direction. McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics had won a fixed-price contract, meaning any cost overrun came directly out of company profit rather than government funding. Admitting early, publicly, that the aircraft was falling behind schedule or gaining weight beyond its targets meant admitting the companies themselves were absorbing costs that could stretch into the hundreds of millions of dollars. There was no financial incentive to surface bad news quickly. There was every incentive to solve problems quietly, internally, and report success up the chain for as long as that story could be sustained. None of this meant fraud. In the legal sense, the courts would spend decades arguing over. It meant something quieter and more dangerous. A program where the structures designed to catch problems early were the same structures making it easiest for those problems to stay hidden. By the late 1980s, the A-12 airframe was already drifting from its original specifications in ways that would eventually prove catastrophic. The weight was climbing. The radar system was falling behind schedule, and almost none of it was visible outside the small classified circle of people whose careers depended on the program's success continuing to look, on paper, exactly like success. The curtain built to protect a stealth aircraft from foreign intelligence services had also, quietly and almost accidentally, hidden the aircraft's problems from the very government paying for it. The composite material was supposed to be the A-12's greatest advantage. Instead, it became the first crack in the entire program. Carbon fiber composite, a lightweight material made of woven carbon fibers bonded together with resin, had been chosen for large sections of the A-12's airframe, specifically because it offered something aluminum and steel could not: A favorable strength-to-weight ratio, along with radar-absorbing properties that could be engineered directly into the material itself rather than added afterward as a coating. On paper, composite construction was the technology that made the A-12's ambitious weight and radar targets achievable at all. In practice, building large, load-bearing composite structures for a carrier aircraft was still an emerging discipline in the late 1980s, and the A-12 pushed it further than any Navy program before it. Composite parts had to be cured in massive autoclaves, pressurized ovens that bond the resin and carbon fiber together under precise heat and pressure, and even small variations in that curing process could produce structural weaknesses invisible to the naked eye. Manufacturing defects that would have been minor on a smaller composite part became serious structural concerns on load-bearing sections the size the A-12 required. Engineers began discovering these problems during testing, and the fixes were rarely simple substitutions. Reinforcing a composite structure that had failed to meet strength requirements usually meant adding material. More layers of carbon fiber, additional metal reinforcement at stress points, thicker panels where thinner ones had been specified. Every reinforcement solved a structural problem and created a new one. It made the aircraft heavier than the design allowed. Weight on an aircraft like the A-12 was not a cosmetic concern. Every additional pound came directly out of the aircraft's performance margins. Its range, its payload capacity, its ability to safely absorb the violent forces of a carrier catapult launch and an arrested landing. And weight growth on the A-12 did not stay contained to isolated components. It compounded. A heavier airframe needed a stronger, heavier landing gear to survive carrier landings. Stronger landing gear needed heavier structural mounting points to carry the additional load. Heavier structural mounting points pushed the aircraft's center of gravity in ways that affected its aerodynamic stability, particularly on a tailless design that already depended on a delicate balance to control its yaw and pitch without conventional tail surfaces. Correcting the aerodynamic imbalance sometimes meant redesigning control surfaces, which meant new hydraulic actuators, which meant more weight still. By the time engineers finished chasing one weight problem to its structural conclusion, 2 or 3 new ones had usually opened up behind it. Internal estimates of the aircraft's empty weight climbed steadily through the late 1980s, eventually settling roughly 30% above the figure the original design had promised, a growth rate that alarmed engineers inside the program long before it became visible to Navy leadership above the classified compartment protecting the program's day-to-day details. The consequences cascaded directly into the performance numbers that had justified the program in the first place. Combat radius, originally projected past 800 nautical miles, shrank as the heavier airframe burned more fuel to carry the same payload the same distance. Payload capacity came under similar pressure, forcing engineers to weigh trade-offs between the weapons load the Navy wanted and the weight margin the airframe could actually sustain without compromising its carrier landing structural limits. Even the aircraft's stealth characteristics were not immune. A heavier airframe required larger control surfaces and structural reinforcements in places where the original design had called for the cleanest possible radar scattering shape, and every deviation from that original shape risked opening new radar reflections. The design had been built specifically to avoid. None of these were the kind of problems that a single engineering fix could resolve. Each one was load-bearing evidence of a deeper mismatch between what the fixed-price contract had promised in 1988 and what carbon fiber composite manufacturing, at this scale, in this configuration, was actually capable of delivering on the timeline the Navy required. Engineers on the program understood the trend line long before anyone outside it did. Weight was not stabilizing. It was compounding, quarter after quarter, in a spiral that consumed engineering hours, contractor profit margins, and most dangerously, the aircraft's own performance promises, one redesign bracket at a time. The material that was supposed to make the A-12 lighter, stealthier, and more capable than anything the Navy had ever flown had become. Instead, the clearest evidence that the aircraft the contract described and the aircraft the engineers could actually build were drifting further apart with every passing month. By 1989, the gap between what the A-12 program reported and what was actually happening on the shop floor had become a chasm, and almost no one with the authority to close it could see across. The warning signs were not subtle to the people closest to the work. Engineers watched the weight figures climb month after month. Manufacturing teams watched deadlines for delivering composite parts slip, then slip again. Program managers watched cost estimates that had once seemed conservative turn into figures nobody wanted to write down in a report that might travel up the chain. Inside the compartmented world of the A-12 program, the problems were not a secret. They were simply contained. Early in 1990, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney launched what became known as the Major Aircraft Review, a sweeping Pentagon-wide examination of the nation's largest weapons programs, driven by shrinking post-Cold War defense budgets and a demand to know exactly what the country was getting for its money. The A-12 was one of the programs under that microscope. It was precisely the moment when honest reporting from inside the program could have surfaced the depth of its problems to the one office with the power to act on them. It did not happen. The review came and went, and the A-12's core structural and financial troubles remained largely invisible above the classified compartment protecting the program's daily operations. Cheney's review did trim the edges of the Navy's plans, cutting the Marine Corps order and slowing the overall production rate, without ever exposing the deeper crisis building beneath the surface. The reporting broke down publicly on June 1, 1990. On that date, the contractor team formally advised the Navy that the program was suffering severe delays and cost overruns far beyond what had previously been disclosed, and that the aircraft's first flight, a milestone the program had been promising for months, would now slip to December 1991. It was the first admission, in writing, that the confident status updates flowing up the chain for months had not reflected reality. The Pentagon's response was immediate disbelief, followed by an uncomfortable question. If the problems were this severe, how had the recent Major Aircraft Review, a process specifically designed to catch exactly this kind of trouble, missed it entirely? Investigators were ordered to find out why the warning signs had not surfaced sooner, through a review process that was supposed to exist for precisely that purpose. By November 1990, a government report had documented the scale of what had gone wrong: cost growth, schedule delays, and technical uncertainty, severe enough that officials could no longer describe the program's problems as manageable. The report landed on Cheney's desk at a moment when patience inside the Pentagon for the A-12's continued optimism had already worn thin. In December 1990, the Navy's Assistant Commander for Contracts, Rear Admiral W.R. Morris, sent the contractors a formal letter stating they had failed to fabricate sufficient parts to permit final assembly and had failed to meet the specification requirements of the contract. The letter ordered McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics to show cause, to formally explain in writing why the Navy should not terminate the contract outright. It was, by any measure, the most serious communication the program had received in its 8-year history. And still, inside the Pentagon, the expectation among most officials was that it would not come to that. A show-cause letter, many assumed, was a pressure tactic, a way to force concessions from the contractors, not a genuine precursor to cancellation. The most common prediction circulating through the building was a government bailout, additional funding, a renegotiated schedule, a face-saving path that let both sides keep building an aircraft the Navy still believed it needed. That assumption rested on a pattern defense officials had seen before. Troubled programs got restructured. Contractors absorbed criticism, adjusted terms, and kept working. Outright termination on a program this large, this far along, with billions already spent, seemed like the kind of decision no Secretary of Defense would actually make. What almost no one inside that assumption accounted for was Dick Cheney's specific question, the one he kept asking in meeting after meeting as December turned into January, and the one that determined everything that came next. Not whether the aircraft could eventually work, but whether anyone in the room could tell him, with any confidence, what it would finally cost. No one could answer that question. Not the Navy, not the contractors, not the program officials who had spent 2 years reporting steady progress up a chain of command that had just discovered how little of that progress had been real. The show-cause letter had asked the contractors to explain themselves. What they returned, in the weeks that followed, would not be an explanation Cheney found remotely satisfying. The meeting that decided the fate of the A-12 program took place on January 5, 1991, and by every account of the people in the room, it did not go the way most of the Pentagon expected. Navy Secretary H. Lawrence Garrett III and senior officials gathered to present Cheney with the contractor's response to the show-cause letter. the formal explanation McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics owed the government for the failures Rear Admiral Morris had documented the previous month. What Cheney heard instead confirmed his worst suspicions rather than easing them. The contractors could not commit to a firm delivery date for a flyable aircraft. They could not specify with confidence what the aircraft's final performance would actually be. And critically, they could not tell him what completing the program would ultimately cost, the same question Cheney had been asking in one form or another for months. According to officials present, the general assessment inside the room was blunt. The current arrangement was not going to work, and the contractors could not proceed under the existing contract as written. The only real choice left on the table was between two options: a government bailout, restructuring the deal and injecting additional funding to keep the program alive, or termination, ending it outright. Most of the Pentagon still expected the bailout. It was the pattern that had played out on other struggling programs for years. Renegotiate, restructure, keep the relationship intact, keep the aircraft alive. Cheney had a different question in mind, and he had been asking a version of it in meeting after meeting throughout the fall. Every time someone in the room mentioned additional costs, he asked how much and how certain that number was. The answer, consistently, was that no one could really say. That uncertainty, more than any single technical failure documented in Morris's letter, appears to have been the deciding factor. An aircraft that was overweight could potentially be redesigned. An aircraft that was behind schedule could potentially be accelerated with enough money and pressure. But a program where no one, not the contractors, not the Navy's own program office, could give the Secretary of Defense a reliable number for what finishing the job would cost was, in Cheney's assessment, a program that had lost the basic financial discipline any contract depended on. He made up his mind sometime after the January 5 meetings concluded. Late that Saturday afternoon, Cheney called Navy Secretary Garrett directly. According to officials who were briefed on the conversation, his message was short and unambiguous. He did not want a bailout. 2 days later, on Monday, January 7, 1991, the Navy formally notified McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics that their contract for the A-12 Avenger II was terminated. Not simply canceled, but terminated for default, on the grounds that the contractors had breached the terms of the agreement. The contractors first learned the news from Admiral Morris directly. It was the same official whose December letter had demanded they show cause. Now he was the one delivering the verdict. Cheney addressed the decision publicly not long afterward, and his own words captured the calculation behind it with unusual clarity. He said the A-12 was not an easy program to terminate because it addressed an important requirement the Navy genuinely needed to fulfill. But he said no one could tell him how much the program would cost, even to complete the development phase alone, or when the aircraft would actually be available. And he added something that would matter enormously in the years of litigation to follow. That data presented to him only months earlier had since turned out to be invalid and inaccurate. The scale of the decision was almost impossible to overstate. It was, at the time, the largest weapons contract termination in the history of the Department of Defense, a program that had consumed roughly $3 billion in expenditures against total appropriations exceeding $6.5 billion, and had produced, after 8 years of development, a single non-flying mock-up sitting in a McDonnell Douglas hangar in St. Louis. Cheney did not stop at ending the A-12. In the same announcement, he reiterated that the Navy's underlying requirement had not disappeared. The fleet still needed a next-generation strike aircraft to eventually replace the aging A-6 Intruder. The mission was real. This particular airplane, built under this particular contract, by this particular team, was not going to be the one that fulfilled it. For McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics, the termination letter was more than the end of a program. It was an accusation. Termination for default did not simply end the contract. It declared, in the government's own legal language, that the contractors were the ones who had failed to meet their obligations, and it came with a bill attached, a demand that the companies return a portion of the payments they had already received on the grounds that the money had funded work the Navy had never accepted as complete. The two companies did not accept that verdict quietly. Within days, both McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics stated publicly that they disagreed they had been in default and that they intended to contest Cheney's decision, not just the cancellation itself, but the very language the government had used to describe why it happened. What began as a single word in a termination letter, default rather than convenience, was about to become the most expensive legal argument in the history of American defense contracting. One word in a termination letter was about to determine whether the United States government owed McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics over $1 billion, or whether the two companies owed the government. Under federal contracting law, the government has two distinct ways to end a contract before it's finished, and the difference between them is not a matter of tone. It is a matter of money, and it runs in opposite directions depending on which one applies. A termination for convenience allows the government to end a contract simply because its own needs have changed. Budget priorities shift, requirements evolve, a program no longer makes sense to continue without accusing the contractor of doing anything wrong. Under this path, the contractor is entitled to be paid for the work it has already legitimately performed, plus reasonable costs associated with winding the program down. It is, in effect, a no-fault divorce. The relationship ends, but nobody is found to have broken their promises. A termination for default is the opposite. It declares that the contractor failed to meet its contractual obligations, missed deadlines, undelivered specifications, breach of the agreement's core terms, and it shifts financial responsibility for the program's failure squarely onto the contractor. Under a default termination, the government is not just released from further payment. It can demand the contractor return progress payments already disbursed for work. The government never formally accepted as complete. When Rear Admiral Morris notified McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics on January 7, 1991, the Navy did not choose the first option. It chose the second. And the number attached to that choice was immediate and enormous. The government demanded the return of $1.35 billion in progress payments, money the contractors had already received, spent, and largely could not simply hand back without severe financial damage to both companies. The contractors' position was straightforward, and they stated it publicly within days of the termination. They did not believe they were in default. Their argument, developed and refined over the years of litigation that followed, rested on a different reading of what had actually gone wrong with the program. The core of that argument was this: the government itself had changed the aircraft's requirements repeatedly over the life of the contract and had failed to provide critical government-furnished technical data and support the contractors were relying on to meet their obligations. If the specifications kept shifting, and if promised government support never fully materialized, the contractors argued, then the resulting delays and cost growth were not a story of corporate failure. They were a story of a customer who kept redesigning the assignment mid-project and then blamed the contractor for missing a moving target. It was not a frivolous argument. Fixed-price contracts assume a reasonably stable set of requirements, a known target the contractor can price, plan, and build toward. If the government meaningfully altered that target after the ink dried in 1988, without formally adjusting the price or the schedule to match, the contractors had at least a colorable claim that they were being penalized for a mismatch they did not create alone. The government's counter-argument was equally direct. Regardless of any requirement changes along the way, the contractors had ultimately failed to deliver what the contract specified, within a budget and timeline the contractors themselves had agreed to when they signed. 8 years and roughly $3 billion had produced a single non-flying mock-up. However the blame was allocated, the aircraft the Navy needed did not exist, and someone had to bear the cost of that outcome. Both sides had genuine, defensible positions, which is precisely why what followed would not be resolved quickly or simply. Within weeks of the termination, McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics filed suit, formally contesting the Navy's default termination. Their legal filing sought two things simultaneously: to have the termination reclassified from default to convenience, a change that would flip the financial obligation entirely, requiring the government to pay the contractors for work performed rather than the reverse, and, separately, to recover payment for legitimate work already completed on the program before it ended. The United States Court of Federal Claims, the federal court with jurisdiction over disputes involving government contracts, accepted the case, and the two sides began preparing for a legal battle that neither of them yet understood would outlast the decade, let alone the year. What had started as an engineering problem, then become a management and oversight failure, was now, formally, a legal one. And in American contract law, legal battles over a single disputed word, default or convenience, do not move quickly. They move through trial courts, through appeals, through reversals, and sometimes through decades, before a final number is ever agreed upon. The A-12 Avenger II would never fly, but its legal case was only just taking off. Litigation over the A-12 would eventually outlast the Berlin Wall's collapse, 2 full presidential administrations, and the corporate identity of one of the 2 companies that started it. McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics filed suit within weeks of the January 1991 termination, and the case landed in the United States Court of Federal Claims, the venue built specifically to referee disputes between the government and its contractors. What no one in that courtroom in 1991 could have predicted was that the case would not reach a final resolution for 23 years, through 5 separate trials and 3 appeals, outliving careers, corporate mergers, and in some cases the professional lives of the lawyers who first argued it. The early rounds went the contractors' way. The trial court initially ruled against the government's position, finding that the Navy's termination for default could not be sustained on the record presented. The judge ordered the classification changed from default to convenience, the legal switch that flips financial liability from contractor to government, and directed the Navy to pay the contractors roughly $1.2 billion for legitimate work performed before the contract ended. For a moment, it looked as though McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics had been vindicated. That victory did not hold. In September 2001, the same trial judge reversed his own earlier ruling, finding that the government had in fact been justified in terminating the contract for default. The reversal flipped the financial exposure entirely. Instead of the government owing the contractors now owed the government the original $1.35 billion in progress payments, plus more than a decade of accumulated interest that had been quietly compounding since 1991. By the mid-2000s, that combined figure had grown past $2.6 billion. The case did not stop there. Both sides appealed. The Federal Circuit Court of Appeals reviewed the record, sent portions of the case back down for further proceedings, and the 2 companies found themselves locked into a legal war of attrition that had, by this point, consumed more calendar time than the entire original development contract had. In August 2002, the Navy escalated the pressure directly. It notified General Dynamics and Boeing, by now Boeing, not McDonnell Douglas, having acquired the company in 1997 and inherited the lawsuit along with it, that unless the roughly $2.3 billion the government claimed it was owed arrived within 30 days, the debt would be handed over to the Defense Finance and Accounting Service for formal collection, the government's mechanism for recovering money by force if necessary. General Dynamics publicly called the demand an aggressive negotiating tactic rather than a genuine ultimatum, and prepared to fight it before the appeals court instead of paying. The corporate landscape around the lawsuit had shifted almost beyond recognition from where it started. General Dynamics sold its entire aircraft manufacturing business to Lockheed Martin in 1993, walking away from the very industry the A-12 had been built for, but it deliberately retained its stake in the lawsuit, calculating that the legal claim itself, separate from the airplane business, still held real financial value. Boeing, meanwhile, had absorbed McDonnell Douglas whole in 1997, inheriting not just its commercial and military aircraft lines, but an unresolved billion-dollar legal liability that had nothing to do with any aircraft Boeing itself had ever built. Both companies were required to hold money in escrow against the possibility of losing the case outright. Boeing alone had set aside roughly $350 million back in 1990, a sum that had been collecting interest for over 2 decades by the time the case finally neared its end. A silent, compounding reminder of an airplane that had never left a hangar in St. Louis. Year after year, the case ground forward through the same cycle: rulings, appeals, remands, renewed trials. Settlement talks opened and stalled repeatedly, each side calculating that the other's legal position might weaken with one more ruling, one more appeal, one more year. Neither side blinked first, and the meter, in legal fees, in accumulating interest, in institutional attention, kept running regardless of who was technically winning at any given moment. By 2013, both sides had spent more than 2 decades and untold millions of dollars in legal costs arguing over an aircraft that had flown exactly 0 times. The dispute had become almost self-perpetuating, a legal fixture within both companies' financial disclosures, a recurring line item in Pentagon litigation reports, a case study cited in law school contracts courses years before it ever reached its conclusion. The final settlement came in January 2014, structured not as a cash payment in either direction, but as an exchange of goods and services. Boeing agreed to provide the Navy 3 EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft and to convert portions of its existing Super Hornet production contracts to fixed-price terms. General Dynamics agreed to provide roughly $200 million in credit against construction work on the DDG-1002, a guided missile destroyer program already underway. The government, in return, agreed to abandon its claim to the money it had spent 2 decades trying to recover. No cash changed hands in either direction. The debt simply evaporated, replaced by warplanes and shipyard credits. Secretary of the Navy Ray Mabus called it the closing of a 23-year chapter in naval aviation history. It was a diplomatic way of describing what the number really represented, a legal dispute that had run longer than the Cold War's final decade, over an airplane whose only physical legacy was a single unpowered mock-up, gathering dust in a hangar that had, by then, changed ownership at least twice. The requirement, Dick Cheney insisted, was still real in January 1991. A Navy that needed a next-generation strike aircraft to replace the aging A-6 Intruder did not disappear when the A-12 program did. It simply had to be answered by something else. The Navy's near-term solution turned out to be far more conservative than the flying wing it replaced. Rather than pursue another radical stealth design, the Navy expanded and evolved the FA-18 Hornet, already in service, already carrier-proven, into a larger, more capable variant. The FA-18EF Super Hornet entered development in the early 1990s and reached the fleet by the end of the decade, offering greater range and payload than the original Hornet without the unproven materials, the tailless aerodynamics, or the fixed-price gamble that had sunk its predecessor. It was not stealthy in the way the A-12 had promised to be. It was, however, real, flying, deployable, and delivered roughly on schedule. The A-6 Intruder itself was retired from Navy service in 1997, 6 years after the aircraft meant to replace it had been terminated for default. For nearly a decade, the exact carrier-based, deep-strike capability the A-12 had been designed to provide simply did not exist in the fleet in the form originally envisioned. A gap absorbed by a combination of Super Hornets, extended-range tankers, and reduced signature weapons rather than any single aircraft built to fill it directly. Genuine stealth eventually did arrive on American carrier decks, just not for another 2 decades, and not from either of the companies that had built the A-12. The F-35C, the carrier variant of the Joint Strike Fighter, achieved initial operational capability with the Navy in 2019, 28 years after Cheney's cancellation letter. Lockheed Martin built it, the same company that had absorbed General Dynamics' entire aircraft manufacturing division in 1993, 2 years after the A-12's collapse. In a quiet historical irony, the program's own architects never lived to see the low observable carrier aircraft the Navy had wanted all along, eventually reached the fleet through a design lineage that ran, indirectly, through the ashes of the very team that had failed to deliver it the first time. The technical lessons of the A-12 outlived the airplane far more directly than any hardware did. Aviation and defense acquisition specialists studying the program's collapse converged on a consistent diagnosis. The failure was not primarily a story of bad engineers or a fundamentally flawed shape. It was a story of a fixed-price contract applied to a technology no one yet knew how to build, wrapped in a classification system that hid the mismatch from the people who might have caught it in time. Aviation historian James Stevenson, who wrote one of the definitive books on the program, argued that shifting leadership, shifting objectives, and shifting funding had made the outcome nearly inevitable. But he was equally clear that the Pentagon's own procurement machinery bore its share of the blame. That diagnosis did not stay confined to academic postmortems. The A-12 became one of the most frequently cited cautionary examples in American defense acquisition reform discussions for decades afterward. Invoked in Government Accountability Office reports, congressional testimony, and internal Pentagon reviews whenever officials debated the wisdom of locking a fixed price to a technology still being invented. The core argument the case left behind was simple and durable. You cannot price what you have not yet learned how to build, and pretending otherwise does not eliminate the risk. It only hides where the risk lands and delays how expensively it eventually surfaces. Some of that lesson visibly shaped the programs that came after it. The Joint Strike Fighter competition that eventually produced the F-35 was structured with extensive prototype flight testing and competitive fly-offs before any single contractor won a production commitment. A deliberate departure from the A-12's approach of committing billions to a fixed-price contract for a design that had never flown at all. It was not a guarantee against future acquisition failures, and the Joint Strike Fighter program would go on to face its own well-documented cost and schedule troubles. But the specific failure mode that killed the A-12, a fixed price locked to an unproven, unflown airframe, became one of the clearest warning signs procurement officials were trained to recognize and avoid. For the two companies at the center of it, the 23-year legal fight left a mark that outlasted the settlement itself. Neither corporation exists today in the form it held in 1991. McDonnell Douglas disappeared into Boeing in 1997, and the A-12 lawsuit disappeared with it, becoming Boeing's inherited legal obligation rather than a debt of the company that had actually built the airplane's mock-up. General Dynamics exited the aircraft manufacturing business entirely in 1993, selling that division to Lockheed Martin while deliberately keeping the A-12 litigation itself, a legal asset unmoored from the business that had created it. By the time the case finally closed in 2014, the companies paying the final bill were, in a very real sense, not quite the same companies that had signed the original contract in 1988. What remains today, physically, is almost nothing. A single non-flying mock-up, the only A-12 airframe ever assembled to any meaningful degree of completeness, has survived in storage, a relic of an airplane that consumed roughly $3 billion in expenditures against total appropriations exceeding $6.5 billion and never once left the ground under its own power. The Navy got the stealth aircraft it wanted, eventually, decades later, built by a different company under a different acquisition philosophy, shaped in no small part by watching this program fail. The two contractors that tried and failed to build it first spent more years fighting over who was to blame than they had spent trying to build the airplane in the first place. And the aircraft itself, the actual physical object at the center of the largest contract termination in Pentagon history, never generated a single second of flight data. It exists today only as a shape in old briefing photographs, a line item in defense acquisition textbooks, and a mock-up gathering dust, proof that in defense contracting, the most expensive failures are rarely the ones that crash. They are the ones that never take off at all.